The North American continent presented diverse environments to its earliest human inhabitants. Ice sheets covered the northern regions during the terminal Pleistocene, while ice-free corridors and coastal routes provided potential pathways for movement. The interior featured vast grasslands supporting large herbivores. River systems drained massive territories, creating resource-rich corridors. Coastlines extended farther seaward due to lower sea levels, though most evidence from these areas now lies submerged. Archaeological sites from this period remain scarce and widely scattered. Researchers debate the timing, routes, and cultural characteristics of initial colonization. The material record consists primarily of stone tools, megafaunal remains, and occasional structural features. Preservation varies significantly across regions. Evidence becomes more abundant after approximately 13,000 years ago. The late Pleistocene environment of North America, spanning roughly from 20,000 to 11,700 years ago, shaped the possibilities for human occupation. The Laurentide ice sheet covered much of present-day Canada and extended southward into the northern United States. The Cordilleran ice sheet blanketed the coastal ranges and interior mountains of the Northwest. Between these ice masses, an ice-free corridor may have opened intermittently, though its timing and viability for human passage remain debated. The unglaciated regions presented varied landscapes. The Great Plains supported grassland and parkland environments. Large herbivores including mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, and several species of bison grazed these areas. The western deserts were cooler and wetter than today, with pluvial lakes occupying many basins. The eastern woodlands contained mixed coniferous and deciduous forests, though their composition differed from modern vegetation. The southeastern regions featured warmer climates with diverse plant and animal communities. Sea levels stood approximately 120 meters lower than present levels. Coastlines extended well beyond their current positions. The Pacific coast featured a now submerged continental shelf. The Atlantic shelf similarly extended eastward. The Gulf of Mexico coastline lay farther south. These drowned landscapes likely contained resources attractive to human populations, but direct evidence remains inaccessible. River systems drained different courses than today. The Mississippi River system carried meltwater from retreating glaciers. Western rivers flowed into pluvial lakes that have since dried. The Great Lakes did not yet exist in their modern form. Glacial lakes formed and drained as ice margins shifted. Temperature fluctuations marked the late Pleistocene. The last glacial maximum occurred around 21,000 years ago, when ice reached its greatest extent. Gradual warming began after this period, though cold reversals interrupted the trend. The Younger Dryas cold interval, lasting from approximately 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, temporarily reversed warming. Climate shifts affected vegetation zones, animal distributions, and water availability. These changes required adaptive responses from human populations. The fauna of this period differed markedly from later times. Megafauna dominated many regions. Columbian mammoths inhabited the southern portions of the continent. Woolly mammoths ranged across northern areas. American mastodons occupied forested regions. Giant ground sloths lived in various environments from coast to coast. Dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, American lions, and short-faced bears represented major predators. Horses and camels, both native to North America before their extinction, grazed alongside bison. Multiple species of peccaries existed. Giant beavers inhabited wetland areas. This diverse megafaunal community provided potential prey for human hunters, though the extent of human predation on these animals remains archaeologically variable. Smaller game animals included deer, elk, pronghorn, and caribou. Waterfowl frequented the numerous lakes and wetlands. Fish populated rivers and lakes. Marine resources existed along coastlines. though evidence for their exploitation during this early period remains limited due to submergence of coastal sites. Plant resources varied by region. Seeds, nuts, roots, and berries would have been available seasonally. The distribution and abundance of plant foods shifted with climate changes. The environmental diversity of late Pleistocene North America meant that human groups entering or inhabiting different regions faced distinct challenges and opportunities. Coastal environments offered marine resources but required watercraft technology. Interior grasslands provided large game but limited plant diversity in some areas. Forested regions contained diverse resources but required different hunting and gathering strategies than open landscapes. Desert basins offered concentrated resources around water sources but demanded knowledge of drought-resistant plants. Mountainous areas provided altitude-dependent resource zones that changed with seasons. Archaeological evidence for human presence during much of this period remains sparse. Sites are few and scattered. Many proposed early sites have generated controversy regarding their dates or the human origin of materials found there. The scarcity of evidence may reflect small population sizes, high mobility, poor preservation, or the submergence of coastal sites. Alternatively, human presence may have been genuinely limited during earlier phases of this period. Researchers continue to investigate and debate these questions. The transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene around 11,700 years ago marked a significant environmental threshold. Temperatures increased relatively rapidly. Ice sheets retreated northward. Sea levels began rising toward modern positions. Vegetation zones shifted. Many megafaunal species went extinct within a relatively short time span. Researchers debate the causes of these extinctions, with hypotheses including climate change, human hunting, disease, or combinations of factors. The environmental changes of this transition required substantial adaptive shifts from human populations across the continent. Understanding the late Pleistocene environment provides necessary context for interpreting the archaeological record of early human presence. The physical landscape, climate patterns, available resources, and ecological communities all influenced where people could live, how they obtained food, what technologies they developed, and how populations moved across the continent. The environments of this period no longer exist in their Pleistocene configurations. Reconstructing them requires evidence from multiple sources, including paleobotany, paleontology, geology, and climate proxies. Archaeological interpretations of early human lifeways depend on these environmental reconstructions. Archaeological evidence for human presence in North America before approximately 13,000 years ago remains contentious. Researchers have proposed numerous sites as pre-Clovis, but many lack secure dating, clear artifact assemblages, or unambiguous evidence of human activity. The debate centers on several key questions, including when humans first arrived, which routes they used, and what their material culture looked like. Some archaeologists argue for human presence as early as 20,000 years ago or more. Others maintain that evidence before 13,500 years ago remains insufficient or unconvincing. The discussion involves both the interpretation of specific sites and broader questions about standards of evidence. Several sites have generated sustained attention in pre-Clovis debates. Monteverde in Chile, located far south of the North American continent, contains materials dated to approximately 14,500 years ago. Its acceptance by many researchers has implications for North American chronology, as it suggests earlier human presence must have occurred to the north. Within North America itself, proposed early sites include Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, where excavators reported cultural materials in levels dated to 16,000 years ago or earlier. Critics have questioned whether these materials derive from later intrusion or whether the dates may be contaminated by coal particles in the soil. The Page Ladson site in Florida has yielded mastodon bones with apparent butchery marks and stone tools in deposits dated to approximately 14,500 years ago. The Friedkin site in Texas contains what excavators identify as stone tools in layers dated to 15,500 years ago or more. The Gault site, also in Texas, has produced materials some researchers place before 16,000 years ago. The Cerruti Mastodon site in California features broken mammoth bones that some investigators interpret as evidence of human activity around 130,000 years ago, though this claim has met widespread skepticism regarding both the dating and the human agency involved. The Bluefish Caves in Yukon contain cut-marked bones dated to approximately 24,000 years ago, though the nature and extent of human activity at the site remains debated. Cooper's Ferry in Idaho presents materials dated to approximately 16,000 years ago in contexts that some researchers accept as cultural. The site contains what proponents identify as stone tools and processing areas in stratified deposits. The Paisley Caves in Oregon preserve human coprolites and western-stemmed projectile points in levels dated to approximately 14,000 years ago. These dates place stemmed point technology contemporary with or earlier than Clovis fluted points in other regions. The implications for understanding early technological diversity and population histories remain under investigation. Several issues complicate the evaluation of proposed pre-Clovis sites. Dating methods may produce anomalous results due to contamination or other factors. Materials identified as artifacts may represent naturally broken stones rather than intentional human manufacture. Features interpreted as hearths or structures might have natural origins. Bone modifications attributed to human butchery could result from animal gnawing, trampling, or geological processes. Distinguishing between natural and cultural processes requires multiple lines of evidence. Sites with only one type of evidence face greater scrutiny than those with diverse indicators of human presence. The standards for accepting sites as genuinely pre-Clovis remain under discussion within the archaeological community. Some researchers apply strict criteria requiring multiple lines of evidence, clear stratigraphy, reliable dating, and unambiguous artifacts. These standards aim to avoid false positives that could mislead interpretations of early human history. Others adopt more inclusive approaches that accept sites based on less comprehensive evidence, arguing that overly strict standards may reject genuine early sites due to preservation limitations or excavation constraints. The tension between these approaches reflects broader epistemological questions about how archaeology establishes knowledge. Preservation conditions affect the visibility of early sites. Coastal areas that may have supported substantial early populations now lie underwater due to post-glacial sea level rise. The continental shelves exposed during the late Pleistocene offered resource-rich environments including estuaries, wetlands, and productive marine zones. Archaeological sites on these drowned landscapes remain largely inaccessible. Offshore surveys using remote sensing and limited underwater excavations have identified submerged features, but comprehensive investigation remains technologically challenging and expensive. The loss of coastal evidence creates gaps in understanding early settlement patterns and subsistence strategies. Geomorphological processes obscure or destroy early sites. Erosion removes deposits. Sedimentation buries materials deeply. Glacial advances during the late Pleistocene obliterated sites in northern regions. River channel migrations rework deposits. Landslides bury or scatter materials. These taphonomic factors reduce the number of early sites available for discovery. The scarcity of pre-Clovis evidence may partly reflect poor preservation rather than actual absence of human populations. However, distinguishing between preservation bias and genuine scarcity remains difficult. The pre-Clovis stone tool technology, where identifiable, differs from later Clovis manufacture. proposed pre-Clovis assemblages often lack the distinctive fluted points characteristic of Clovis. Instead, tools include simple flakes, choppers, and expedient implements manufactured with minimal investment. Some sites contain bifaces, but not fluted forms. The Western stem tradition points from Paisley Caves and other sites represent a distinct technological approach. If pre-Clovis populations existed widely, their stone tool traditions were either substantially different from Clovis or have not been recognized clearly in the archaeological record. Population size before 13,000 years ago, if humans were present, must have been very small. The scarcity of sites, even accounting for preservation issues, suggests limited numbers. Small populations occupying vast territories would generate sparse archaeological signatures. Low population density would make site discovery difficult. Alternative explanations propose that pre-Clovis occupations focused on now submerged coastal zones, leaving interior regions sparsely populated or unoccupied. This coastal migration model suggests that early groups moved southward along Pacific coastlines, exploiting marine resources while interior routes remained blocked by ice sheets or ecologically unproductive. The Beringia refugium hypothesis proposes that populations existed in eastern Beringia, the unglaciated regions of Alaska and Yukon, during the last glacial maximum. These populations would have been isolated from regions south of the ice sheets until corridors opened or coastal routes became viable. Archaeological evidence from Alaska and Yukon remains limited for the period before 14,000 years ago, though some sites suggest human presence. The Swan Point site in Alaska contains materials dated to approximately 14,000 years ago. If Beringian populations existed earlier, they left minimal archaeological traces or occupied areas not yet investigated. The ice-free corridor between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets has featured prominently in models of human entry into the Americas. This corridor, when open, would have provided an overland route from Beringia to the plains. However, recent geological and paleontological research indicates the corridor remained closed or ecologically unproductive until approximately 13,000 years ago. Glacial lakes, limited vegetation, and scarce fauna would have made passage difficult. Before this time, these findings challenge models proposing early interior migration routes and strengthen arguments for coastal migration paths. Coastal migration routes along the Pacific Rim offer an alternative entry model. Deglaciation of coastal areas occurred earlier than interior regions. Marine resources would have supported populations moving southward. Watercraft technology would have been necessary for coastal travel, and some early sites suggest maritime capabilities. The kelp forest ecosystems along the Pacific coast provided rich resources. However, direct evidence for coastal migration remains limited due to sea level rise. The model gains support from Monteverde's early date and coastal location, suggesting populations reached South America via coastal routes before interior corridors opened. Genetic evidence from modern Native American populations and ancient DNA provides additional perspectives on pre-Clovis questions. Genetic studies indicate that Native American populations derive from ancestral groups in Northeast Asia. The timing of divergence between Asian and American populations remains debated, with estimates ranging from 20,000 to 15,000 years ago or more. Ancient DNA from Clovis age individuals shows genetic continuity with later Native Americans, indicating Clovis populations were ancestral to subsequent indigenous groups. Whether pre-Clovis populations existed and contributed genetically to later groups remains unclear from current genetic data. The multiplicity of proposed pre-Clovis sites across diverse regions suggests that if earlier populations existed, they were geographically widespread rather than confined to limited areas. This distribution would require either very early entry into the Americas or rapid expansion from initial entry points. The variability in proposed pre-Clovis technologies suggests either multiple entry events with different cultural traditions or substantial regional diversification following a single entry. Distinguishing among these scenarios remains difficult given current evidence. Research continues at proposed pre-Clovis sites and new locations. Improved dating techniques provide more reliable chronologies. Better understanding of site formation processes helps distinguish cultural from natural materials. Interdisciplinary approaches, combining archaeology, geology, paleontology, and genetics, strengthen interpretations. The pre-Clovis debate will likely continue until consensus emerges around multiple well-documented sites with unambiguous evidence. Until then, the question of human presence before 13,000 years ago remains open, with ongoing research gradually clarifying the nature and timing of the earliest American populations. The Clovis archaeological complex, dating to approximately 13,000 to 12,800 years ago, represents the first widely recognized and accepted cultural tradition across North America. Unlike the debated pre-Clovis evidence, Clovis materials appear in clear archaeological contexts with reliable dates across nearly the entire continent. The sudden appearance of Clovis in the archaeological record, its distinctive technology, and its rapid geographic spread have made it a focal point for understanding early human adaptation in the Americas. The Clovis phenomenon lasted only 2 to 3 centuries, yet left an archaeological signature that has shaped interpretations of early colonization for generations. The geographic distribution of Clovis extends from Alaska to Panama and from coast to coast. Clovis points and associated materials have been recovered from most U.S. states, several Canadian provinces, and portions of Mexico and Central America. This continental-scale distribution within a brief temporal window raises fundamental questions about how such widespread similarity emerged so quickly. The densest concentration of Clovis sites occurs in the Plains region, particularly the Central and Southern Plains, and in the Southwest. The Southeast also contains numerous Clovis find spots. Western regions, including California, the Great Basin, and the Northwest show sparser, but definite Clovis presence. The Northeast has yielded Clovis materials, though in lower numbers than other eastern regions. The distribution pattern may reflect actual population density, with higher numbers in plains and southwestern regions, or may result from survey intensity and preservation conditions. Grassland environments preserve sites differently than forested areas. Plowing in agricultural regions brings artifacts to surface visibility more readily than undisturbed forests. Collector activity concentrates in some regions more than others, affecting the known distribution. Despite these biases, the basic pattern of continent-wide presence within a narrow time frame remains valid. No other early period archaeological complex shows comparable geographic extent and temporal compression. Clovis stone tool technology centers on the production of fluted projectile points. These implements exhibit careful bifacial thinning, creating thin cross-sections relative to their width and length. The defining characteristic involves the removal of channel flakes from one or both faces of the base. These flutes extend upward from the base for varying distances, sometimes reaching halfway up the point length or beyond. The purpose of fluting remains debated. Most researchers suggest fluting facilitated hafting onto wooden or bone shafts, with the channel allowing the point to seat firmly against the shaft. The basal edges show grinding, presumably to prevent the sharp edges from cutting binding materials. Manufacturing fluted points required substantial skill and raw material investment. Toolmakers prepared bifaces through careful thinning before attempting flute removal. The fluting strike required precise force application at the correct angle. Many preforms broke during fluting attempts, as evidenced by manufacturing debris at workshop sites. Success rates varied, with some assemblages showing high breakage rates. Once successfully fluted, points received final edge retouch to create the finished form. The labor investment and technical demands suggest these were valued items rather than expedient tools manufactured and discarded casually. Clovis assemblages include tool types beyond projectile points. Large bifaces served as cores for flake production or as knives and cutting implements. Many bifaces show no fluting and may represent unfinished points or tools serving other functions. End scrapers manufactured on blades or flakes occur frequently in Clovis contexts. These tools presumably worked hides, though their specific functions remain inferential. Side scrapers and gravers appear in smaller numbers. Blade technology, involving the systematic removal of parallel-sided flakes from prepared cores, occurs at some Clovis sites. Blades served as blanks for tool manufacture or as cutting implements themselves. Bone and ivory working appears in Clovis contexts at several sites. Bone rods with beveled ends occur at multiple locations. Their function remains uncertain, with proposals including foreshafts for composite projectiles or hide-working tools. Bone projectile points manufactured from large mammal bones appear at some sites. Ivory from mammoth tusks was shaped into various implements. The Anzac site in Montana contained bone and ivory rods alongside stone tools. The working of organic materials demonstrates technological sophistication extending beyond stone tool manufacture. Raw material procurement patterns reveal extensive territorial ranges or exchange systems. Clovis toolmakers preferentially selected fine-grained cryptocrystalline stones, including various cherts, chalcedonies, jaspers, and obsidians. These materials fracture predictably and allow precise control during manufacture. Chemical characterization and visual identification connect artifacts to specific geological sources. Studies document that stone materials frequently traveled 100 to 200 kilometers from sources to deposition locations. Some materials moved 300 to 500 kilometers or more. The Anzac cache contained stone from sources in Wyoming, North Dakota, and possibly other distant locations. The Simon cache in Idaho included obsidian from Yellowstone and other sources hundreds of kilometers away. These long-distance movements indicate either high residential mobility or exchange networks. High mobility models propose that Clovis groups ranged widely across landscapes, directly procuring stone from sources during their movements. Annual ranges of several hundred kilometers would allow groups to visit multiple source areas. Ethnographic studies of mobile hunter-gatherers document territorial ranges of this magnitude in some environments. Exchange models suggest that materials passed between groups through trade, gift-giving, or other transfer mechanisms. Both processes may have operated, with direct procurement at some sources and exchange providing additional materials. Clovis sites vary in type and function. Kill sites contain faunal remains alongside stone tools. These locations preserve evidence of animal processing and consumption. Campsites show more diverse activities, including tool manufacture, hide processing, and general habitation. These tend to be small, suggesting brief occupations. Workshop sites near stone sources contain manufacturing debris, including broken preforms, flakes, and raw material. Caches represent buried collections of finished tools or preforms. Some caches contain a few items, while others include dozens of pieces. The reasons for cache deposition remain uncertain. Possibilities include storage for future retrieval, ritual offerings, or burial goods. Isolated finds of single Clovis points occur across the landscape, representing loss during use or discard. Major Clovis sites provide key evidence for understanding the complex. The Blackwater Draw site in New Mexico, one of the original Clovis localities discovered in the 1930s, preserves mammoth remains associated with Clovis artifacts in a stratified context. Multiple mammoths were processed at the location. The site established Clovis as a distinct archaeological complex and provided early radiocarbon dates. The Murray Springs site in Arizona contains evidence of mammoth and bison processing alongside Clovis tools. A black organic mat separates Clovis deposits from overlying Folsom materials, providing clear stratigraphic separation. The Anzac site in Montana, discovered in 1968, contained over 100 stone and bone artifacts, buried with the remains of an infant. The burial represents the only known Clovis interment, with associated grave goods. Ancient DNA extracted from the skeletal remains shows genetic continuity with later Native American populations, demonstrating that Clovis people were ancestral to subsequent indigenous groups rather than representing a separate population that disappeared. The Gault site in Texas preserves an extensive Clovis occupation with thousands of artifacts including points, tools, and manufacturing debris. The site demonstrates long-term or repeated use of a favorable location. The Colby site in Wyoming features stacks of mammoth bones interpreted by excavators as caches of meat for later retrieval. The bone arrangements appear purposeful rather than natural. If correctly interpreted, these caches demonstrate planning and food storage strategies. The Dent site in Colorado represents a mammoth kill location with remains of multiple animals. The Langa-Ferguson site in South Dakota contains mammoth bones with associated Clovis tools. These kill sites demonstrate that Clovis populations hunted or scavenged proboscideans, though the frequency and importance of this activity remains debated. Subsistence evidence indicates broader diets than early interpretations suggested. Initial discoveries at kill sites led to characterizations of Clovis as specialized big game hunters focused on mammoth. Subsequent research revealed more diverse prey. Bison remains occur at several sites. Smaller mammals including rabbits, rodents, and carnivores appear in faunal assemblages. Bird bones occur at some locations. The preservation bias favoring large animals creates a skewed picture. Megafaunal bones survive better than remains of smaller prey. Plant remains preserve rarely except in special contexts. The presence of grinding stones at some sites suggests plant processing, though these tools remain less common in Clovis than in later periods. The relationship between Clovis and terminal Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions has generated extensive debate, extending beyond archaeology into broader scientific discussions. Approximately 35 genera of large mammals disappeared in North America between 13,000 and 10,000 years ago. These extinctions removed mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, ground sloths, and numerous other species. The temporal overlap between Clovis and extinctions prompted overkill hypotheses proposing that human hunting caused or significantly contributed to these extinctions. Models suggest that human populations expanding into previously uninhabited territories encountered naive prey populations with no evolved fear of human predators. Intensive hunting could have driven populations below sustainable levels. Critics of overkill hypotheses note that climate change during the Pleistocene-Holocene transition altered habitats substantially. Warming temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, and vegetation shifts affected large herbivores. Many extinct species had survived previous climate oscillations during the Pleistocene, but the combination of environmental change and human predation during this transition may have been fatal. The relatively small number of kill sites suggests humans exploited but did not intensively specialize on most extinct species. Mammoth kill sites number in the dozens across the entire continent, hardly suggesting intensive specialized hunting. Most researchers currently favor explanations involving multiple interacting causes rather than single-factor models emphasizing either climate or hunting alone. Population estimates for Clovis times remain highly speculative. Archaeological site density suggests relatively small populations. Estimates range from a few thousand to perhaps 50,000 individuals continent-wide, though these figures rest on numerous assumptions about site visibility, group size, and territorial ranges. The widespread distribution requires explanation regardless of absolute numbers. Small populations numbering in the low thousands could have expanded rapidly, given favorable conditions and the absence of competing human groups. Demographic models suggest that colonizing populations entering unpopulated or sparsely populated territories can double every generation under optimal conditions. Such expansion rates could produce continent-wide distribution within a few centuries. Settlement and mobility patterns reflect high residential mobility. Sites show brief occupations without evidence of long-term habitation structures. Tool curation and resharpening patterns indicate that people carried tools over substantial distances, using and maintaining them rather than discarding and replacing them frequently. The distribution of exotic stone materials demonstrates long-distance movements. These patterns characterize highly mobile hunter-gatherers rather than sedentary or semi-sedentary populations. Seasonal movements likely tracked resource availability. Whether movements followed specific prey species, particularly megafauna, or responded to multiple resource opportunities remains unclear. Social organization probably involved small bands as the fundamental residential unit. Ethnographic studies of mobile hunter-gatherers typically document band sizes of 20 to 50 individuals. Larger aggregations would have occurred periodically when resources concentrated or for social purposes including mate exchange, information sharing, and ceremonial activities. Cache sites containing unusually large numbers of high-quality tools might represent ritual deposits or storage locations associated with aggregation sites. The maintenance of technological similarity across vast distances requires social networks transmitting information. Whether this occurred through direct contact as groups encountered each other, through long-distance movements of individuals, or through other mechanisms remains uncertain. The end of Clovis around 12,800 years ago coincides with the onset of the Younger Dryas climatic interval. This cold reversal brought cooler and often drier conditions across much of North America. The environmental changes may have disrupted subsistence patterns dependent on specific resources. Megafaunal extinctions removed significant prey animals. These combined pressures likely forced adaptive changes. Following Clovis, archaeological cultures diversified rapidly into regional traditions. Folsom emerged on the plains with its distinctive deeply fluted points and focus on extinct bison. Western regions developed stemmed point traditions. Eastern areas produced diverse unfluted lanceolate and notched point styles. This regionalization suggests populations adapted to local environmental conditions rather than maintaining the continent-wide technological uniformity characteristic of Clovis. The Clovis phenomenon occupies a pivotal position in North American prehistory. Its sudden appearance, technological distinctiveness, rapid geographic spread, and brief duration pose interpretive challenges. Whether Clovis represents an initial colonizing population, a technological innovation spreading among existing populations, or some combination remains debated. The relationship to pre-Clovis occupations, if they existed, requires clarification. Genetic evidence demonstrates continuity between Clovis and later Native Americans, establishing that Clovis people were ancestral to subsequent indigenous populations rather than a separate group that disappeared. Understanding Clovis remains fundamental to interpreting the broader patterns of human adaptation during the terminal Pleistocene and the transitions leading to the diverse regional cultures of the Holocene. The transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene around 11,700 years ago brought substantial environmental changes that affected human populations across North America. Temperatures increased, though not uniformly or steadily. Ice sheets retreated northward. eventually disappearing from most of the continent by approximately 8,000 years ago. Sea levels rose as glacial meltwater entered the oceans, submerging coastal areas and creating modern shoreline configurations. The Great Lakes formed in the depressions left by retreating ice. River systems adjusted to new drainage patterns. Vegetation zones shifted northward and to higher elevations. These environmental transformations occurred over centuries and millennia, requiring adaptive responses from human groups. The extinction of North American megafauna occurred during this transitional period. Mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, ground sloths, and numerous other large mammals disappeared between approximately 12,000 and 10,000 years ago. The causes of these extinctions remain debated. Climate change altered habitats and vegetation communities that supported these animals. Human hunting may have contributed to population declines, particularly for species with slow reproductive rates. Disease represents another proposed factor. Most researchers now favor explanations involving multiple interacting causes rather than single-factor models. The loss of megafauna removed significant prey animals from the subsistence base available to human populations. Archaeological cultures following Clovis show regional diversification. The Folsom culture, dating from approximately 12,800 to 12,000 years ago, appeared primarily on the Great Plains. Folsom points display distinctive fluting that extends nearly the full length of the point, requiring considerable skill to produce. Folsom assemblages occur primarily with bison remains rather than mammoth or other megafauna. The Folsom bison represented an extinct species larger than modern forms. Kill sites preserve evidence of communal hunting, with multiple animals processed at single locations. The Lindenmeyer site in Colorado, the Blackwater Draw site in New Mexico, and numerous other localities contain Folsom materials. Folsom represents a more geographically restricted phenomenon than Clovis, concentrated in the Plains region. Following Folsom, Plains cultures developed diverse projectile point styles. Plainview points lack fluting but maintain lanceolate forms. Goshen points overlap temporally with Folsom in some areas. Various regional point styles emerged, including Agate Basin, Hell Gap, Alberta, and Cody complexes. These traditions date roughly between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago. All focus primarily on bison hunting, though other resources were also exploited. The post-Folsom diversification suggests increasing regional adaptation and the development of local traditions. In the eastern woodlands, point styles diverged from Western traditions. The Dalton culture, dating from approximately 10,500 to 9,900 years ago, occupied areas from the Mississippi Valley to the Atlantic coast. Dalton points show beveled bases and reworking patterns suggesting extensive use and curation. Dalton sites include both small camps and larger base camps. Some sites contain evidence of plant processing. The Hardaway site in North Carolina preserves a sequence of point styles, including Hardaway, Palmer, and Kirk types, dating from the terminal Pleistocene into the early Holocene. These Eastern traditions reflect adaptations to forested environments with different resource distributions than the plains. Western regional traditions also diversified. The Western stemmed tradition, characterized by stemmed rather than fluted projectile points, appears in the Great Basin, the Columbia Plateau, and along portions of the Pacific coast. Sites like Paisley Caves in Oregon contain western stemmed points in levels dated to approximately 13,000 years ago, contemporary with, or possibly earlier than Clovis. The relationship between fluted and stemmed point traditions remains unclear. They may represent different populations, different adaptations to distinct environments, or different technological solutions to similar problems. The Windust culture of the Columbia Plateau, dating from approximately 11,000 to 9,000 years ago, features stemmed points and evidence for fishing in addition to hunting. Environmental changes during the early Holocene required subsistence adjustments. The extinction of megafauna meant that large game hunting focused on surviving species, primarily bison in grassland areas, elk and deer in forested regions, and caribou in northern zones. Plant resources gained increased importance. Seeds, nuts, roots, and other plant foods required processing technologies, including grinding stones. The development of milling equipment appears in multiple regions during this period. Manos and metates for grinding seeds occur in the Great Basin and Southwest. Mortars and pestles appear in other areas. The intensity of plant processing varied regionally based on available resources. Fishing technology developed or intensified during the early Holocene. Sites along major river systems contain fish remains and fishing equipment. The Dalles area of the Columbia River shows early use of salmon resources. Coastal sites, where preserved, indicate marine resource exploitation. The Arlington Springs site on California's Channel Islands contains human remains dated to approximately 13,000 years ago, demonstrating early coastal presence and likely boat technology. Shell middens along various coastlines preserve evidence of shellfish collection, though many early coastal sites now lie underwater due to sea level rise. Settlement patterns shifted during the early Holocene. The high mobility characteristic of Clovis gave way to more regionally focused adaptations in many areas. Archaeological sites become more numerous, suggesting population growth or increased archaeological visibility. Base camps with evidence of repeated occupation appear more frequently. Tool assemblages show greater diversity than earlier periods, reflecting varied subsistence activities. The exploitation of multiple resource types required different tools and processing techniques than specialized large game hunting. Climate fluctuations continued through the early Holocene. The Younger Dryas cold interval, lasting from approximately 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, temporarily reversed warming trends in some regions. Following the Younger Dryas, temperatures generally increased, though regional and temporal variations occurred. Precipitation patterns shifted. Some areas became drier, while others experienced increased moisture. The altithermal or hypsothermal period, roughly 9,000 to 5,000 years ago, brought warmer and often drier conditions to many regions, particularly the interior. These climatic shifts affected resource availability and distribution, requiring continued adaptation. Regional population distributions adjusted to changing environments. Some areas appear to have experienced population decline during dry phases, while others saw increased use. The Great Plains witnessed reduced occupation during portions of the altithermal as drought conditions intensified. Great Basin populations concentrated near remaining water sources. Coastal areas may have attracted populations from drying interior regions. The archaeological record shows spatial reorganization in response to environmental change. Technological innovations facilitated exploitation of changing resource bases. The atlatl, or spear thrower, appears to have been widely used during this period, allowing hunters to throw projectiles with greater force and distance than hand-thrown spears. Different projectile point styles emerged to serve various functions and prey species. Nets, traps, and other technologies for capturing smaller game and fish developed or became more common. Plant processing technology expanded. Storage facilities appear at some sites, suggesting seasonal abundance that required preservation for later use. The early Holocene established patterns that would characterize subsequent periods. Regional diversification replaced the continent-wide similarity of Clovis. Subsistence broadened to include multiple resource types rather than focusing heavily on large game. Settlement systems developed greater structure with base camps and specialized activity sites. Population sizes likely increased, though reliable estimates remain difficult. The archaeological record becomes denser and more diverse. providing more information about human lifeways than earlier periods. These transitions set the stage for further cultural elaboration in subsequent millennia. The Middle Holocene, spanning roughly from 8,000 to 3,000 years ago, witnessed the development of distinct regional archaeological traditions across North America. Environmental conditions stabilized relative to the preceding period, though significant variations occurred. Human populations adapted to local resource distributions, creating material culture and settlement patterns specific to different ecological zones. The archaeological record becomes substantially richer during this period, with more numerous sites and more diverse artifact assemblages. In the Great Basin, the Archaic period cultures developed specialized adaptations to desert environments. Population focused on areas with reliable water sources, including springs, marshes, and lake margins. Pluvial lakes from the Pleistocene had largely dried, leaving smaller remnant water bodies. Groups exploited diverse plant resources, including piñon nuts, various seeds, roots, and desert succulents. Hunting targeted deer, antelope, mountain sheep, and smaller mammals including rabbits and rodents. Nets and snares appear to have been important technologies for capturing small game. Groundstone tools for processing seeds became common. Storage pits at some sites indicate seasonal harvest and preservation of plant foods. The Danger Cave and Hog Up Cave sites in Utah preserve extensive evidence of Great Basin archaic lifeways. Dry cave conditions preserved perishable materials, including basketry, cordage, hide items, and plant remains. These sites show occupation spanning thousands of years, with accumulations of cultural materials. The equipment recovered demonstrates sophisticated fiber technology. Basketry occurred in multiple forms and techniques. Sandals made from plant fibers protected feet in rocky terrain. Nets of varying mesh sizes served different capture purposes. The preservation of organic materials at these sites provides unusual insight into technologies that rarely survive in other contexts. On the Columbia Plateau, cultures adapted to riverine and upland environments. Salmon runs provided concentrated seasonal resources. Sites along major rivers show evidence of intensive fishing. The Marms Rock Shelter in Washington contained stratified deposits spanning from the early Holocene through the late Holocene. Multiple pithouse villages appeared in some areas, indicating increased sedentism. Root crops, including camas bulbs, provided important plant foods, requiring specialized processing, including pit roasting. Hunting continued to target deer, elk, and smaller game. The combination of salmon, roots, and game supported larger populations than many other interior regions. In California, regional diversity reflected the state's varied environments. Coastal populations exploited marine resources, including fish, shellfish, sea mammals, and seabirds. Shell middens accumulated at repeatedly occupied locations. The Channel Islands preserve evidence of maritime adaptations, including sophisticated boats, fishing technology, and sea mammal hunting. Interior valley populations focused on terrestrial resources, including deer, elk, waterfowl, and especially acorns. Oak woodlands provided abundant acorn crops that, despite requiring labor-intensive processing to remove bitter tannins, offered high nutritional returns. Grinding equipment for acorn processing became ubiquitous. Trade networks connected coastal and interior groups, with shell beads moving inland and obsidian moving toward coasts. The Southwest developed distinctive adaptations during the Middle Holocene. Early farmers began cultivating maize after approximately 4,000 years ago, though the transition to agricultural dependence occurred gradually. Maize arrived from Mexico, where domestication had occurred earlier. Initial cultivation supplemented continued hunting and gathering rather than replacing it. Squash also entered the region during this period. Sites in southern Arizona and New Mexico contain early evidence of cultivation. The subsistence economy remained diverse, with wild plant foods and game continuing to provide substantial portions of the diet. Populations retained considerable mobility despite farming, moving between field locations and wild resource zones. In the plains, bison hunting remained central to subsistence, though methods and scales varied. Communal bison hunting using jump sites and pounds appears in the archaeological record. Jump sites utilize topography to drive bison over cliffs or steep embankments. Pounds involved constructing corrals or enclosures to trap animals. These techniques required coordination among multiple individuals or groups. The Olson Chubbuck site in Colorado preserves remains of nearly 200 bison killed in an arroyo trap around 8,500 years ago. Processing sites show systematic butchery and bone tool manufacture. However, bison populations fluctuated with climate and grassland productivity. During dry phases, populations declined, and human occupation of some plains areas decreased correspondingly. The eastern woodlands developed complex archaic traditions. Multiple regional variants emerged, including the St. John's culture in Florida, the Orange culture of the southeast coastal region, the Poverty Point culture of the lower Mississippi Valley, and various traditions in the Northeast and Midwest. The environment provided diverse resources, including deer, turkey, fish, shellfish in coastal areas, and abundant plant foods, including nuts, seeds, and fruits. Hickory nuts and acorns represented particularly important nut crops. Rivers and streams provided fish, freshwater mussels, and waterfowl. Seasonal rounds moved groups through territories to exploit resources as they became available. Shell-midden sites along rivers and coasts preserve evidence of intensive shellfish use. Some middens reach substantial size, indicating repeated occupation over extended periods. The presence of large middens suggests reduced mobility compared to earlier periods, with populations remaining in productive areas for longer durations. The Green River shell mounds in Kentucky represent major accumulation sites with associated burial areas. Burials at these sites contain grave goods, including stone tools, shell beads, and bone implements, indicating attention to mortuary practices. The Poverty Point culture, flourishing between approximately 3,700 and 3,100 years ago in the lower Mississippi Valley, represents an unusual development. The Poverty Point site itself features massive earthworks, including concentric ridge arrangements. The ridges likely supported structures. The site's size and complexity suggest large populations or seasonal gatherings. Artifacts include elaborate stone tools manufactured from raw materials obtained from distant sources hundreds of kilometers away. Thousands of small baked clay objects of various shapes occur at the site. Researchers debate their function, with proposals including cooking stones for earth ovens. Trade networks connected Poverty Point to sources of copper from the Great Lakes region, stone from the Appalachians and Ouachita Mountains, and other materials from across eastern North America. The level of organization and coordination required to construct the earthworks and maintain far-flung exchange networks indicates social complexity. Ground stone tools became common across most regions during the Middle Holocene. Mortars, pestles, manos, and metates appear in contexts where plant processing occurred intensively. The manufacture of ground stone tools required different techniques than flaked stone technology. Pecking and grinding shaped the tools from suitable raw materials. The investment of labor in producing these tools suggests extended use and perhaps curation. Different grinding tool forms suited different processing tasks and different types of plants. Projectile point styles continued to diversify regionally. Side-notched, corner-notched, and stemmed points appeared in various forms across different areas. Point sizes generally decreased over time, possibly reflecting changes in hunting technology or prey species. Smaller points may have tipped atlatl darts or arrows, though the timing of bow and arrow adoption varies by region. Other stone tools, including knives, scrapers, drills, and perforators, served various functions. Bipolar reduction techniques, using an anvil to break cores, appear more frequently, perhaps as high-quality lithic raw materials became scarcer or as people utilized smaller pieces of material. Bone and antler tools served multiple purposes. Awls made from bone splinters worked hides and fiber materials. Fish hooks manufactured from bone occur at some sites. Harpoons and lysters for spearing fish appear in fishing contexts. Bone needles indicate sewing technology. Antler flakers helped manufacture stone tools. The use of organic materials expanded the toolkit beyond stone implements. Evidence for watercraft increases during the Middle Holocene, though direct preservation remains rare. The presence of sites on islands and the exploitation of marine resources in open water contexts imply boat technology. Canoes manufactured from dugout logs or bark would leave little archaeological trace. The distribution of some raw materials across water barriers demonstrates transport capability. Burial practices show regional variation. Some areas practice cremation, while others use flexed or extended inhumation. Grave goods occur in some burials, but not others, possibly reflecting status differences, though interpretations remain uncertain. Cemetery areas appear at certain locations, indicating repeated use of specific places for interments. The treatment of the dead provides some evidence for social organization and belief systems, though specific interpretations require caution. Climate during the Middle Holocene included the warmer and drier Altithermal period in its earlier phases. This warm interval affected different regions variably. The plains experienced drought and reduced bison populations. The Southwest saw shifts in vegetation zones. The Great Basin lakes shrank to smaller sizes. Coastal regions experienced less dramatic impacts. After approximately 5,000 years ago, conditions generally became cooler and moister, though regional variations continued. These climate shifts influenced resource distributions and required adaptive adjustments. Population estimates for the Middle Holocene remain speculative, but suggest gradual growth overall, though with regional variations. More numerous archaeological sites indicate either larger populations or decreased mobility that made occupations more visible archaeologically. Some areas show evidence of territorial circumscription, with groups occupying more restricted ranges than earlier periods. Increased sedentism in resource-rich areas contrasts with continued high mobility in more marginal environments. Trade and exchange networks expanded during the Middle Holocene. Materials moved substantial distances from their sources. Obsidian from Western sources appears in sites far to the east. Marine shells traveled inland from coasts. Copper from the Lake Superior region occurs in sites throughout eastern North America. The mechanisms of exchange remain debated, with possibilities including direct procurement, down-the-line trade, and specialized traders. The presence of exotic materials demonstrates connections between distant regions. The Middle Holocene established foundations for subsequent developments. Regional cultural traditions became more distinct. Subsistence economies diversified and intensified. Settlement patterns showed increasing structure and in some areas reduced mobility. Social complexity began emerging in certain regions. Technological repertoires expanded. The archaeological record preserves increasing evidence of these developments, providing more detailed pictures of prehistoric lifeways than earlier periods allow. The intensification of resource use accelerated during the period from approximately 3,000 to 1,000 years ago across many regions of North America. Populations increasingly focused on particular high-yield resources, developing specialized technologies and processing methods to exploit them efficiently. This intensification often involved greater labor investment, but produced higher returns that could support larger or more sedentary populations. The shift toward intensive resource use varied in timing and character across different environmental zones. In the Pacific Northwest, salmon fishing intensified substantially during this period. Major river systems, including the Columbia, Fraser, and coastal streams, supported massive annual salmon runs. Groups developed specialized equipment for capturing fish in large numbers. Weirs constructed across streams channeled fish into traps. Dip nets on long poles allowed individuals to capture fish from platforms built over rapids and falls. Harpoons and lysters speared individual fish. The seasonal concentration of salmon provided opportunities for mass harvesting. Processing technology focused on drying and smoking fish for storage. Cedar plank houses appeared in some areas, indicating year-round occupation at productive locations. Large villages developed at prime fishing sites. The abundance and predictability of salmon resources supported population densities higher than most other non-agricultural regions. Acorn processing intensified in California during this period. Oak woodlands provided annual nut crops that varied by species and elevation. Groups harvested acorns in large quantities during fall. Processing required removing shells, grinding nuts into flour, and leaching out bitter tannins through repeated water applications. Purpose-built leaching facilities appear at some sites. Storage granaries preserved acorns for use throughout the year. The labor requirements for acorn processing were substantial, but the nutritional returns justified the investment. Acorn-based economies supported large populations in favorable areas. Villages of considerable size existed in oak-rich zones. Hunting and fishing supplemented acorn consumption, with deer, waterfowl, and fish contributing to the diet. In the eastern woodlands, cultigens became increasingly important, though hunting and gathering remained significant. Maize agriculture spread northward and eastward from the southwest, reaching the eastern woodlands by approximately 2,000 years ago. Initial adoption occurred slowly. Indigenous seed crops including chenopod, marsh elder, squash, and sunflower had been cultivated in eastern regions before maize arrival. These native crops required less labor and suited local growing conditions. Maize productivity in northern latitudes initially remained modest. Over time, selection for shorter growing seasons adapted maize to cooler climates. By 1,000 years ago, maize had become a dietary staple in many areas. Beans arrived later, around 1,000 years ago. The combination of maize, beans, and squash provided complementary nutrition. The shift toward agricultural dependence in the East correlated with increased sedentism. Villages occupied fixed locations near agricultural fields. Populations grew as agricultural productivity increased. The investment in clearing fields and constructing substantial houses encouraged reduced mobility. However, hunting and gathering continued to contribute significantly to subsistence. Deer hunting remained important. Fish and shellfish supplemented diets. Seasonal camps in resource-rich areas operated alongside base villages. The Eastern agricultural complex represented a mixed economy rather than complete agricultural dependence. In the Southwest, agricultural intensification transformed societies during this period. Maize, beans, and squash cultivation became central to subsistence. Populations constructed irrigation systems to increase agricultural productivity. Canals directed water from streams to fields. Check dams in arroyos captured runoff. Agricultural terraces on slopes conserved soil and water. These water management systems required coordinated labor for construction and maintenance. Village sizes increased substantially. Architecture shifted from pit houses to above-ground masonry or adobe structures. The Hohokam culture in southern Arizona developed extensive canal systems along the Salt and Gila rivers. Some canals extended many kilometers. Villages featured ball courts, suggesting organized social activities or ceremonial functions. Platform mounds appeared at major sites. The ancestral Puebloan culture in the Four Corners region constructed increasingly large settlements. Early pit house villages gave way to above-ground room blocks. Chaco Canyon in New Mexico emerged as a major center between approximately 850 and 1150 CE. Great houses at Chaco contain hundreds of rooms arranged in multi-story structures. Specialized rooms included great kivas, large ceremonial chambers. Roads connected Chaco to outlying communities across the region. The organizational complexity required to construct great houses and maintain regional connections indicates hierarchical social structure. Trade networks brought turquoise from distant mines, marine shells from the Gulf of California, copper bells from Mexico, and macaw feathers from regions far to the south. The concentration of exotic goods at Chaco suggests differential access controlled by elites. Agricultural intensification carried risks. Dependence on cultivated crops made populations vulnerable to drought and crop failure. The Southwest experienced substantial climate variability. Multi-year droughts caused agricultural shortfalls. Some regions witnessed population abandonment during severe droughts. The Chaco system collapsed around 1150 CE, possibly due to environmental degradation, resource depletion, and drought. Populations dispersed to other areas or reorganized into different settlement patterns. The relationship between agricultural intensification, population growth, environmental stress, and social reorganization appears repeatedly in southwestern archaeology. In the Great Plains, bison hunting intensified through improved techniques and coordination. Jump sites and pounds continued in use. The scale of kills sometimes involved hundreds of animals. The head-smashed-in buffalo jump in Alberta represents a site used repeatedly over thousands of years. Careful management of the landscape guided herds toward jump locations. Processing sites adjacent to kills show systematic butchery. Preservation of meat through drying produced pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries that stored for extended periods. The ability to preserve large quantities of meat from communal hunts reduced subsistence risk. However, bison populations fluctuated with climate and grassland productivity, creating uncertainty in resource availability. Bow and arrow technology spread across much of North America during this period, though timing varied regionally. The bow appeared in the Arctic by approximately 4,500 years ago. It reached the Great Basin and Southwest around 1,500 years ago. Eastern regions adopted bow technology at roughly similar times. The bow offered advantages over the atlatl, including faster shooting rates and easier portability. Projectile points became smaller to serve as arrow tips. Different point styles developed for different hunting contexts and prey species. Storage technologies expanded across regions. Pits, granaries, and other facilities preserved food surpluses for later consumption. Storage allowed populations to remain sedentary rather than moving to follow seasonal resources. It also buffered against short-term scarcity and enabled populations to survive through winter. The accumulation of stored foods created new social dynamics, as control over surpluses conferred status and power. Trade networks reached maximum extent and complexity during this period. Exchange connected regions across the continent. Marine shells from the Pacific reached the plains and east. Gulf Coast shells moved northward and westward. Obsidian from multiple sources traveled hundreds of kilometers. Copper from the Lake Superior region spread widely. Turquoise from southwestern sources appears in distant locations. Exotic birds and their feathers moved northward from Mexico. The mechanisms maintaining these networks remain debated. Direct procurement, sequential exchange, specialized traders, and tribute systems all may have operated in different contexts. Craft specialization appeared in some regions. Certain sites or areas produced particular items in quantities exceeding local needs, suggesting production for exchange. Shell bead manufacturing sites in California processed marine shells into beads that served as currency. Pottery production concentrated at locations with suitable clays. Lithic workshops near high-quality stone sources produce tools for distribution. Specialization implies some degree of economic differentiation and interdependence among communities. Pottery manufacture spread widely during this period, though adoption timing varied by region. Ceramics appeared in the southeast by approximately 4,500 years ago, making it one of the earliest pottery traditions in North America. Southwestern pottery developed around 2,000 years ago. Plains, Great Basin, and many other regions adopted pottery later. Pottery facilitated cooking, storage, and transport of liquids and foods. Different regions developed distinctive pottery traditions with characteristic forms, decorations, and manufacturing techniques. Pottery styles serve as chronological markers and indicate cultural affiliations and exchange patterns. Population growth during this period appears in multiple lines of evidence. Sites become more numerous. Villages increase in size. Agricultural field systems expand. Settlement patterns show denser occupation. Skeletal analyses indicate dietary stress in some populations, possibly reflecting population pressure on resources. However, population trajectories varied regionally, with some areas experiencing growth while others saw stability or decline. Conflict evidence increases during this period in several regions. Defensive architecture, including palisades, ditches, and strategically located settlements, suggests warfare concerns. Skeletal trauma consistent with violence appears more frequently. Some sites show evidence of burning and destruction. Southwestern cliff dwellings may reflect defensive considerations. The causes of increased conflict remain debated, with hypotheses including competition for resources, territorial circumscription, and social tensions accompanying increased complexity. Social complexity continued developing in regions with intensive resource bases. Chiefly societies emerged in some areas characterized by hereditary leadership, social ranking, and centralized decision-making. The Mississippian culture in the Southeast, discussed further in relation to the late prehistoric period, exemplifies complex chiefdom organization. Evidence for status differentiation includes differential burial treatments, unequal access to exotic goods, and substantial investment in elite residences or mortuary facilities. Currency systems appeared in some regions. Shell beads served as money in California and adjacent areas. Standardized bead types functioned as units of exchange. The production, distribution, and accumulation of shell bead currency created economic hierarchies. Control over bead production or exchange routes conferred wealth and status. Other regions may have used different valuables as currency or operated through gift exchange and reciprocity rather than formal monetary systems. Ceremonial elaboration increased during this period. Earthwork construction for ceremonial purposes appears in multiple regions. Effigy mounds in the upper Midwest represent animals, birds, and geometric forms. Platform mounds in the Southeast served as foundations for temples or elite residences. The labor investment in ceremonial architecture suggests organized religions and priestly classes. Ritual objects including carved pipes, engraved shells, and elaborate pottery appear in special contexts. These items indicate ceremonial activities and possibly specialized ritual knowledge. The intensification of resource use during this period transformed societies across North America. Increased focus on high-yield resources supported larger populations. Technological innovations improved extraction and processing efficiency. Storage facilities enabled sedentism and buffered scarcity. Trade networks integrated distant regions. Social complexity emerged in areas with intensive economic bases. These developments set the stage for the elaborate societies documented at European contacts. The late prehistoric period, roughly spanning from 1,000 years ago to European contact, witnessed the culmination of indigenous developments across North America. Population densities reached their maximum in many regions. Agricultural societies expanded in areas with suitable growing conditions. Hunter-gatherer populations in other regions developed sophisticated strategies for exploiting local resources. Social organization became increasingly complex in multiple areas. Trade networks connected distant communities. The archaeological record from this period provides detailed evidence of diverse cultural traditions. The Mississippian culture dominated much of the Southeast and parts of the Midwest from approximately 1,000 to 500 years ago. Mississippian societies constructed large towns centered on platform mounds, supporting temples, elite residences, and ceremonial structures. Cahokia, located near present-day St. Louis, represented the largest Mississippian center. The site featured more than 100 mounds, with Monk's Mound rising approximately 30 meters high and covering over 5 hectares at its base. Population estimates for Cahokia at its peak around 1100 CE range from 10,000 to 20,000 inhabitants, making it the largest pre-contact settlement north of Mexico. Cahokia's influence extended across much of the Midwest and Southeast through trade and possibly political connections. Mississippian subsistence centered on maize agriculture, supplemented by beans and squash. Agricultural fields surrounded towns and villages. Hunting provided deer, turkey, and other game. Rivers supplied fish and freshwater mussels. The intensive agricultural base supported dense populations and craft specialists who did not directly produce food. Mississippian societies exhibited clear social hierarchies. Elite burials contain elaborate grave goods, including copper artifacts, marine shell ornaments, engraved ceramics, and other valuable items. Commoner burials show minimal grave goods. The differential treatment indicates inherited status differences. Chiefs apparently controlled tribute systems and organized labor for mound construction and maintenance. Mississippian ceremonial life involved elaborate rituals. The southeastern ceremonial complex, evident in artifacts from multiple Mississippian sites, featured shared iconographic motifs, including birdmen figures, weeping eyes, hands with eyes, and cross symbols. These motifs appear on engraved marine shells, embossed copper plates, ceramic vessels, and stone palettes. The wide distribution of similar symbols suggests shared religious concepts across the Mississippian world. Chunky, a game involving rolling a stone disc and throwing spears at it, appears to have held ceremonial significance. Chunky stones occur at many Mississippian sites. Mississippian towns typically featured central plazas surrounded by platform mounds. Palisades with bastions enclosed many towns, indicating defensive concerns. Warfare evidence includes fortifications, burned structures, mass burials, and skeletal trauma. Competition for agricultural land, tribute, and prestige likely motivated conflicts. Some regions witnessed cycles of mound center emergence, fluorescence, and abandonment. Cahokia itself declined after approximately 1200 CE, with population dispersing. Environmental degradation from deforestation, resource depletion, and possibly climate change may have contributed to the decline. Other Mississippian centers continued flourishing until European contact disrupted indigenous societies. In the Southwest, populations reorganized after the abandonment of Chaco Canyon. The ancestral Puebloan culture concentrated in several regions, including the Rio Grande Valley, the Little Colorado River area, and Mesa Verde. Large pueblos housed hundreds or thousands of individuals. Multi-story room blocks contained residential, storage, and ceremonial spaces. Kivas, both small and large, served religious and social functions. Agricultural terraces, check dams, and water management systems supported farming. Cliff dwellings appeared in some areas, with settlements built into natural alcoves in canyon walls. Mesa Verde in Colorado preserves numerous cliff dwellings, including Cliff Palace and Long House. The defensive advantages of cliff locations may have reflected increased warfare or raiding. The ancestral Puebloan region experienced significant population movements during the late prehistoric period. The Four Corners area saw widespread abandonment around 1300 CE. Populations migrated southward and eastward, settling in the Rio Grande Valley and Hopi Mesas. The causes of these movements likely included prolonged drought, resource depletion, and possibly social conflict. Tree ring data documents severe droughts during the late 1200s. Agricultural failure would have forced populations to relocate to areas with more reliable water sources. The Hohokam culture in southern Arizona continued developing irrigation agriculture. Canal systems reached maximum extent during this period. Platform mounds and ball courts characterized major villages. Cremation remained the predominant burial practice, distinguishing Hohokam from neighboring cultures. The relationship between Hohokam and Mesoamerican cultures to the south remains debated. Similarities in architecture, ceremonial features, and material culture suggest contacts, but the nature and extent of interaction remain unclear. The Hohokam tradition declined around 1450 CE, with populations declining or reorganizing. The descendants of Hohokam likely include the O'odham peoples, documented at contact site. The Casas Grandes culture in northwestern Mexico and southwestern New Mexico developed a distinctive tradition during the late prehistoric period. The site of Paquime featured multi-story adobe buildings, ceremonial ball courts, elaborate water systems, and evidence of macaw breeding. Trade networks connected Paquime to regions far to the south and north. Marine shells, turquoise, copper artifacts, and other goods moved through the site. Paquime's influence extended across the region until its abandonment around 1450 CE. In California, populations reached high densities in favored locations. Acorn-based economies supported large villages. The Chumash people along the Southern California coast developed complex societies with craft specialization, hereditary chiefs, and elaborate ceremonial life. Plank canoes allowed offshore travel to the Channel Islands and supported marine mammal hunting. Shell bead currency systems reached maximum elaboration. Bead production required specialized skills and tools. Wealth accumulation created social hierarchies. Chiefs organized labor, maintained trade relationships, and sponsored ceremonies. The Chumash represent one of the most complex hunter-gatherer societies documented ethnographically. The Pacific Northwest cultures continued intensive salmon exploitation. Large plank houses accommodated extended families or lineages. Totem poles carved from massive logs displayed family crests and mythological figures. Elaborate woodworking traditions produced canoes, boxes, masks, and ceremonial objects. Social organization featured ranked lineages with chiefs, commoners, and slaves captured in warfare. Potlatch ceremonies involved feasting and gift-giving that established or validated status. Northwest coast societies accumulated substantial wealth in the form of preserved fish, marine resources, and prestige goods. Art styles reached high levels of sophistication, with distinctive regional variations. The Plains cultures developed diverse adaptations during the late prehistoric period. Village-based farmers occupied river valleys in the eastern plains, cultivating maize, beans, and squash while hunting bison. The coalescent tradition in the Middle Missouri region featured fortified villages with earth lodges. Populations aggregated into large settlements, possibly in response to warfare threats. Western Plains populations maintained mobile bison hunting economies. Teepee rings, stone circles that held down teepee covers, mark campsites. Bison procurement remained central, with drives, jumps, and pounds continuing in use. The introduction of the horse in the historic period would transform plains cultures, but before contact, dogs served as pack animals and travois pullers. In the Northeast, Iroquoian and Algonquian peoples developed distinct cultural traditions. Iroquoian populations constructed large longhouses that sheltered multiple families. Villages featured palisades for defense. Agriculture focused on maize, beans, and squash. Women managed agricultural production, while men hunted and engaged in warfare. The Iroquois Confederacy, a political alliance among 5 nations, may have formed during the prehistoric period, though its dating remains uncertain. Algonquian peoples occupied territories from the Atlantic coast to the Great Lakes, practicing mixed economies of agriculture, hunting, fishing, and gathering. Coastal groups exploited marine resources, while interior populations focused on terrestrial resources. The Arctic and subarctic regions developed specialized adaptations to extreme environments. Thule culture, ancestral to modern Inuit peoples, spread across the Arctic from Alaska to Greenland after approximately 1,000 years ago. Thule groups hunted large marine mammals including whales, seals, and walrus. Sophisticated maritime technology included sealskin boats, harpoons with detachable heads, and dog sleds. Winter houses featured stone and whalebone frames covered with sod. Summer occupations used hide tents. Storage pits preserved meat in permafrost. Subarctic populations pursued caribou, moose, fish, and smaller game. Snowshoes and toboggans facilitated winter travel. Seasonal rounds moved groups through territories to exploit resources as they became available. Population estimates for North America at contact vary substantially among researchers. Early estimates suggested 1 to 2 million for the entire continent north of Mexico. More recent analyses propose higher figures, with some estimates reaching 7 to 10 million or more. Regional population densities varied dramatically. California may have supported 300,000 or more inhabitants. The Southeast likely contained dense populations, with estimates ranging from several hundred thousand to over 1 million. The Southwest population estimates range from 100,000 to 400,000. The Great Basin supported perhaps 25,000 people. Northeastern populations may have numbered several hundred thousand. The variability in estimates reflects uncertainties in interpreting archaeological and ethnohistoric evidence. Agricultural regions generally supported higher population densities than hunter-gatherer areas, though exceptions existed. California's hunter-gatherers achieved densities comparable to some agricultural regions due to intensive acorn exploitation and abundant marine resources. The Northwest coast similarly supported dense populations through salmon fishing and other resource use. In contrast, the Great Basin and Subarctic supported sparse populations due to limited resources. The relationship between subsistence strategies and population density shows strong but not absolute correlations. Settlement patterns at contact reflected diverse adaptations. Agricultural societies occupied permanent villages near fields. Hunter-gatherers maintained varying degrees of mobility, from near-sedentary coastal groups to highly mobile desert populations. Seasonal movements characterized many groups, with different locations occupied at different times of year. The size and permanence of settlements correlated generally with resource predictability and abundance. Technological repertoires at contact included sophisticated adaptations to local environments. Stone, bone, wood, fiber, hide, and ceramic materials served various functions. Regional tool traditions reflected specific resource exploitation strategies and available raw materials. The bow and arrow had largely replaced the atlatl across most regions. Traps, nets, weirs, and other devices captured fish and game. Grinding tools processed seeds and nuts. Pottery vessels served cooking and storage needs in most regions. though some areas including California and the Northwest Coast made limited use of ceramics. Trade networks at contact connected regions across vast distances. Marine shells, obsidian, copper, turquoise, and other materials traveled far from their sources. Pipestone from Minnesota quarries appears in sites across the plains and beyond. Pacific shells reached the plains and southeast. Gulf Coast shells moved inland. These exchange networks integrated communities into larger social and economic systems. The mechanisms of exchange included gift-giving, direct trade, and possibly specialized merchants in some regions. Warfare at contact appears to have been widespread, though variable in intensity. Fortifications, weapons, skeletal trauma, and ethno-historic accounts document conflicts. Motives included territorial disputes, revenge, capture of resources or people, and prestige-seeking. Some regions experienced chronic raiding, while others saw less frequent conflicts. Warfare influenced settlement locations, with defensive sites preferred in conflict-prone areas. Alliances and confederacies formed partly in response to warfare threats. Social organization at contact ranged from egalitarian bands to complex chiefdoms. Leadership structures varied from informal influence to hereditary chiefs with substantial authority. Status differentiation existed in many societies, with elites controlling resources, trade, and ceremonial activities. Kinship systems structured social relationships and determined resource access, marriage patterns, and political affiliations. The diversity of social organizations reflected different economic bases, population sizes, and historical trajectories. Ceremonial life at contact involved elaborate practices documented through archaeology and ethnohistory. Religious specialists conducted rituals. Ceremonial structures served communal gatherings. Sacred objects held spiritual significance. Mortuary practices ranged from simple burials to elaborate mortuary programs involving mounds, grave goods, and complex rituals. The archaeological record preserves only material aspects of ceremonial life, with belief systems and mythologies accessible primarily through later ethno-historic accounts. European contact initiated demographic and cultural transformations that reverberated across North America. The timing of initial encounters varied by region, beginning in the Caribbean in 1492 and spreading gradually across the continent over subsequent centuries. Spanish expeditions reached the southeast and southwest in the early 16th century. French explorers contacted populations in the Northeast and Great Lakes regions during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. English colonization began along the Atlantic coast in the early 17th century. Russian contacts occurred in Alaska during the 18th century. Some interior regions remained outside direct European contact until the 19th century. The pace and character of contact varied substantially across these different regions and time periods. Disease represented the most catastrophic impact of European contact on indigenous populations. Native Americans lacked immunity to Old World pathogens, including smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, and numerous other diseases. Epidemics spread rapidly, often advancing ahead of direct European presence through indigenous trade networks and population movements. Mortality rates during epidemic outbreaks frequently reached 50 to 90% of affected populations. Multiple epidemic waves struck regions over decades and centuries. The cumulative demographic impact was devastating. Population decline began immediately in contact zones and spread outward. The Caribbean indigenous populations collapsed within decades of 1492. Mainland regions experienced similar trajectories as contact intensified. The Southeast witnessed severe population losses during the 16th and 17th centuries. Spanish expeditions documented large towns and chiefdoms, but these societies collapsed or reorganized under disease pressure and conflict. By the 18th century, Southeastern populations had declined dramatically from contact period levels. The Southwest experienced substantial population losses, though some pueblos maintained continuity. California populations declined severely during the Spanish Mission period and subsequent American settlement. Northeastern populations suffered major losses during the 17th century. Estimates of total population decline from contact through the late 19th century suggest losses of 90% or more in many regions. If pre-contact populations numbered 5 to 10 million north of Mexico, post-contact naders around 1900 reached perhaps 250,000 to 500,000. The scale of population loss represents one of the largest demographic catastrophes in human history. The causes extended beyond disease to include warfare, displacement, resource disruption, and social disintegration, accompanying the collapse of traditional systems. Archaeological evidence documents contact period transformations. European trade goods appear in indigenous sites, including metal tools, glass beads, cloth, and firearms. Indigenous populations adopted some European technologies while maintaining traditional practices. Metal points and tools supplemented or replaced stone implements. Glass beads served ornamental and ceremonial functions. Cloth competed with hide and fiber materials. The selective adoption of European items followed indigenous priorities and existing exchange patterns. Settlement patterns shifted in response to European presence. Some populations relocated to avoid contact or conflict. Others moved closer to trade posts or missions. Defensive considerations influenced location choices. Populations aggregated into larger communities for protection or fragmented into smaller dispersed groups. Agricultural field systems in some regions fell into disuse as populations declined. Villages and towns documented archaeologically in pre-contact times often show abandonment or substantial reorganization during contact periods. Subsistence economies experienced disruptions. The fur trade redirected labor toward trapping and processing pelts for exchange. Commercial hunting depleted some game populations. European livestock competed with wild game for forage. Agricultural production declined in areas experiencing severe population loss. Traditional resource management practices broke down as demographic collapse reduced labor forces. Food security deteriorated in many regions, despite European trade goods partially supplementing indigenous foods. Social organization transformed under contact pressures. Traditional leadership structures weakened or disappeared as population decline reduced community sizes below viable thresholds. Some leaders adapted by cooperating with European powers, serving as intermediaries. Others resisted through warfare or withdrawal. Kinship systems experienced strain as deaths eliminated entire families or lineages. Ceremonial practices declined as populations lacked sufficient participants, or as mission programs suppressed indigenous religions. Some groups merged with others as populations became too small to maintain independent existence. Warfare intensified in many regions during contact periods. Competition for European trade goods motivated conflicts. Access to firearms created military imbalances. European powers encouraged indigenous allies to raid enemies. Slave raids targeted populations for sale to European colonies. The Iroquois Wars in the Northeast during the 17th century involved large-scale conflicts, driven partly by fur trade competition. Plains warfare escalated with horse adoption and firearms acquisition. Southwestern populations faced Spanish military expeditions and raids. The archaeological record documents increased fortifications, burned settlements, and violence-related skeletal trauma during contact periods. Cultural persistence occurred alongside transformation. Indigenous populations did not simply disappear or completely abandon traditional practices. Many groups maintained core cultural identities despite devastating population losses. Languages persisted, though sometimes with reduced speaker populations. Oral traditions continued transmitting historical knowledge and cultural values. Material culture retained indigenous characteristics, even as European items were incorporated. Subsistence practices adapted to new conditions while maintaining continuity with earlier patterns. Social organizations reorganized but retained indigenous principles of kinship and leadership. The mission system in the Southwest California and Florida concentrated indigenous populations in controlled settlements. Missions aimed at religious conversion and cultural transformation. Populations experienced forced labor, restricted movement, and suppression of traditional practices. Disease spread readily in mission communities due to crowding and poor conditions. Many individuals fled missions when possible. Mission archaeology documents the material conditions of these institutions and the resistance strategies employed by indigenous residents. Trade posts and forts became focal points for interaction. Indigenous populations traveled to posts to exchange furs, hides, and other products for European goods. Posts served as nodes in exchange networks that extended far into interior regions. Archaeological investigations of trading posts reveal the material exchanges occurring and the mixing of European and indigenous items in these contexts. Some posts evolved into permanent settlements, while others operated seasonally or relocated frequently. Colonial settlements displaced indigenous populations from traditional territories. Land appropriation for agriculture, ranching, and resource extraction reduced areas available for indigenous use. Competition for resources generated conflicts. Treaties and land cessions, often coerced, transferred territories from indigenous to European control. The loss of land undermined traditional subsistence economies and forced populations into smaller areas or onto reservations. Missionization, settlement displacement, and population decline combined to disrupt archaeological continuity. Sites occupied for centuries were abandoned, traditional territories emptied of inhabitants. Artifact assemblages show mixtures of indigenous and European materials reflecting cultural transitions. The archaeological record becomes increasingly difficult to interpret as indigenous and European materials intermingle and as population movements scramble spatial patterns. Indigenous responses to contact varied across groups and over time. Resistance took multiple forms, including military opposition, withdrawal to refuge areas, and cultural persistence despite pressure to assimilate. Accommodation strategies involved selective adoption of European technologies and participation in colonial economies while maintaining indigenous identities. Adaptation allowed some groups to survive demographic catastrophe and persist into later periods. The diversity of responses reflected different circumstances, different degrees of contact intensity, and different indigenous traditions and priorities. The end of the prehistoric period, defined by European contact, did not represent the end of indigenous presence or cultural development. Indigenous populations survived, adapted, and continued evolving. However, contact fundamentally altered the conditions of existence. The demographic collapse, territorial losses, cultural disruptions, and incorporation into colonial systems marked a decisive transformation. The archaeological record documents both the catastrophic impacts and the persistence of indigenous peoples through this transition. The material evidence shows continuity and change operating simultaneously as populations navigated unprecedented challenges. The transition from prehistory to history, marked by the appearance of written records alongside archaeological evidence, provides opportunities for richer understandings, but also introduces complexities. European written accounts offer detailed information about indigenous societies, but reflect outsider perspectives often biased or incomplete. Ethnohistoric sources require critical evaluation. Archaeological evidence continues providing material documentation of indigenous experiences during and after contact. The integration of archaeological and documentary evidence illuminates this transformative period while acknowledging the limitations of both types of sources.